Thanks so much, Andrew, and other panelists. For those of you joined us just now, Shamsi provided an interesting insight into the notion of microproductivity, work-life balance, and equitable design. Daniel provided a rather macro perspective about the work landscape, gig economy, the issues of precarious work and in this new work landscape, and the role of machine learning tools in shaping that. Tressie was she gave us an interesting set of perspective about non-job work, hustle economy, exploitation, and racialized aspect of the platform capitalism. And Andrew, he gave us an interesting insight in the organizational dynamics of technology implementation and important questions, ethical and efficiency-oriented question we got to ask before putting tools into organizational adaptation and before using them in organizations. So we've got one question. I think Susan Natalie asked if we are providing a recording of this online conversation. I think we do. It's going to be available on our YouTube channel. And now this is opportunity for folks to ask questions. If you panelists want to throw in question for other panelists to start the conversation, please feel free to do that. Shamsi, are you?
Yeah, I was waiting to see if there's a silence where I can pop in a question. So yeah, I was quite, I mean, thanks to all the panelists. I think that this was super interesting, but I was particularly intrigued by what Andrew mentioned during his talk and thinking about kind of like this power dynamic between what organizations are trying to get at and what individuals feel. I mean, this tension between the organization goals and individual goals and whether or not they're at odds with each other. Or maybe there's just a general sense of, maybe I shouldn't say distrust, but lack of understanding of what the organization's goals might be. Because as an individual, if I feel that the tool that I'm using, even though it gives me some benefits, it might be misconstrued in some way. I mean, one is that would I want to use it? But number two, more importantly, can I get away with not using it? And so, I mean, Andrew, you have done obviously work in this space. I'm curious to see what kind of like autonomy people have who are on the kind of like the lower end of the power spectrum in being able to make these kinds of decisions.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think, it varies so much company to company in terms of, what are the norms and practices, even, I mean, around the ability of IT departments to let you select your own software. But, given that you have a company that has more of a top-down selection process, I think often workers don't have a lot of, ability to say no. So if there's a piece of software that either, kind of in the neutral case might just create busy work for them, but in kind of more pathological cases might be a tool of surveillance or other kind of more negative outcomes. I think sometimes it's a choice of you use the tool or you lose your job. And I'm really curious for other perspectives on this too, because I have, somewhat more limited kind of scope in terms of doing field research on this. I think maybe some other folks on the panel have done more, and I'm really curious what you all think.
I was, Shamsi, I think it's a really good question. And I would, so economists have been saying for a long time that like you see the computer revolution, you can tell this is an old canard, that you can see the computer revolution anywhere but the productivity statistics. We just like have not had substantial productivity growth at work outside of a brief blip in the 90s that some of us are skeptical about for other reasons. I mean, this is just total speculation, but I think like with a lot of networked technologies, while the surveillance can be quite real and the top-down control can be quite real, I think there are often, frankly, more ways to adjust or ignore or avoid the work process compared to something like the assembly line, which is much more clearly regulated on the boss's time about what is supposed to be completed when. So this is just rank speculation, but I feel like you might be able to read a successful story of workplace, not organizing, but resistance, reclaiming of free time into the fact that we've deployed all these incredible tools and none of them have worked because people have figured out how to dodge them, how to play solitaire, how to be on Facebook. Like, you know, if you spend any significant time in an office, you see like people are quite good at tricking whatever system is going on right now in order to get their free time. Even before you get into the office, like something like automated hiring has this whole cottage industry of like community cheating forums online where people like kind of do like community audits about the personality questionnaires to figure out the right answer to give. They try to share what they think were correct answers that led to a certain job. So I think that's, you know, there may be some interesting things here where a lot of these tools, while there are very scary possibilities, allow for more adaptability and refusal than elsewhere in the economy.
I think that's a great point. I just wanted to interject with one thing. I mean, there's this, again, how do you balance between, so you want to empower individuals. And I mean, there are tons of signals in the individual's own data that can help them kind of like understand their behavior at work, say, for example, or even beyond work. Is that, well, am I spending my time, I mean, in a effective manner? Am I getting enough breaks? Am I getting this and that? And so, I mean, as a person who does look at individual productivity and well-being pretty deeply, and so I am curious about how can you help people kind of like have trust in these systems. It's a matter of how you design it and where the data stays and all of those things. But just like, and how do you push people over that hump that, well, this is for your benefit, and unless there's a specific reason, let's not assume that it is going to be used for a different purpose. I mean, there's this balance between what do I get as an individual, and I think that Andrew, you touched upon this as well, is that why would I use something unless the benefit to me is very clear? Because at the end, it might be just used for, I mean, maybe firing me or taking some kind of action on me.
I mean, I think both you and Andrew are talking about at the end of the day about democracy, and there is just frankly no democracy in the majority of American workplaces. And I mean that quite literally insofar as like most of our, just in the US, like most of our rights about something like free speech in the First Amendment go completely out the door as soon as we walk into the workplace. Like it is a dictatorship with a different kind of legal regime than it is in the public square. And those norms about public accountability and getting everyone together to figure out the best way forward and stakeholder consultation, that is the exception rather than the norm. And I wish it were different. And I think like there are real possibilities for fulfilling work if we can get over that first bridge. And in many ways, that's the history of participatory design. Like participatory design is grounded in the experience of Scandinavian unions, who were primarily trying to figure out the best way to do new deployments in manufacturing, and demanded, in a way that American unions very rarely did, input on the deployment process and consultation on how to do that. And that was where that kind of participatory design tradition came from in Scandinavian informatics. And we have a relatively different one in the UK and US.
So let me throw in a question that one of the participants, one of the attendees asked. In the 1990s, companies went from having a personnel department to human resource department. It seems this managerial mindset echoes the points one of the speakers made earlier about employees being replaceable building blocks. Any takes on that name change?
Yeah, I guess that's me. It's a complicated thing. Tressie, I'd like to hear what you think too, but like HR is often presented as the worker-facing side of the firm, but obviously they're still, employed and instructed and paid by management. So there is a different valence to that as opposed to, real workplace democracy. But I think that human resources are historically part of the problem of dealing with, again, more complicated workplaces where it's harder to measure productivity than just putting stuff on the assembly line. Like what we know as human resources is largely succeeds the kind of industrial psychology stuff that Frederick Taylor did, where, you just got a stopwatch and you're watching someone, how fast they can dig, and then you kind of redesign the way they dig so you can go somewhere else. Human resources has its roots in a different kind of workplace psychology that is much more invested in, people's emotional state at work, the relationships to management, those kind of things. So it's, it is both more personal and more, all enveloping. Like human resources covers more of you as a person than, IR approaches that are just interested in sheer productivity.
Great. So let me ask you a difficult question. If everyone, please answer this question. If you were to give me two important characteristics of AI system that shape the future of our work, our knowledge work, what would be those two salient characteristics? If you want to boil it down to only two important characteristics, two things that they need to achieve.
Two things that we want them to do in the future, or that they're doing them right now?
Either. If it's happening right now, great. If not, they have to be part of the system design and system thinking and management thinking. Andrew, let me put you on the spot.
Oh man. I would go back to some of the themes that have come up here earlier. I think, to me, questions of kind of privacy and control are pretty central. Those could play out in different ways, but I think particularly with systems that are difficult to understand and reason about, then I think giving some window of transparency for people to understand why is this thing doing what it's doing, and then also to control it, for humans to have kind of agency and more of a locus of control rather than kind of ceding to the algorithm, to me feel like important things to navigate if we're going to integrate these more deeply into work and into broader kind of society.
As somebody who cares deeply about racial inequality in particular, there are only two things that have ever worked in work, past, present, and I suspect in the near and far future, to help at least mitigate the historical reproduction of racial inequalities, which are experienced across the spectrum. So I'm not just talking about Black, white racial gaps. I'm talking about how it manifests in gender disparities and nationality disparities, language acquisition disparities, sexuality disparities at work. It's actually tied to the question about like where HR comes from, by the way, and some of the earlier questions about like what AI technologies and productivity tools are supposed to do at work. Arguably what they're supposed to do is the same thing HR was doing, which is they're supposed to put a material veneer on immaterial work so that it can be proven as legitimate, surface it so that it can be measured, forecasted, and arguably used to raise more capital. That's quite literally all it's supposed to do. How else are you going to raise, as we've become increasingly more reliant on things like venture capital funding and these webs of financialization? You have got to make something immaterial, knowledge work, look material for the purposes of raising more capital. And that's quite literally what human resources is there to do. The flip side of that is to evade regulation. So, which then feeds into my answer of what I would want an AI to do. And the only things that technological innovations have ever contributed to mitigating racial inequality. And I draw here on the importance of things like social science data and large scale survey administrative data during the civil rights movement that helped move the needle on inclusive hiring practices and promotion practices. And that is what AI was arguably, given political power to supplant the importance of the administrative state in doing precisely that. And two things have worked. It needs to be regulated and it needs to be transparent. The challenge there, of course, is that AI promises to be neither of those things. And that is in part why it is so popular, because it takes data that is obscured either because we don't have the technical know-how to surface it, or because it is expensive or otherwise prohibitive to know where it came from, to trace it, to store it, to make sort of linear chronological sense of it and to re-embody it. And it gives us the promise of making sense of this sort of inchoate chaos of data patterns without giving you any underlying transparency right? So it gives you summations, it gives you summary data without giving you any of the underlying data sources, which in and of itself is a kind of obfuscation. So transparency is the solution to that. That has historically come through labor unions, through regulation, through social movements that demand sort of transparency of whatever the technology regime is of the time. And then the other, of course, is regulation, the thing we've been very resistant to do, which is to consider these technologies as form of ownership and managerial control and monopoly, and to treat them as such.
Yeah, to echo what Tressie said, like it was kind of a side point on here, but I really do think like the majority of application systems that we're using today are ADA violations. Like they are asking for private medical information, and there's a big lawsuit going on in, I think, Florida right now. It's been wrapped up in appeals about that forever. And I'm from around DC, where we have one of the larger Black middle classes in the country. And why do we have that? We have that because of the rigid, boring, frustrating federal bureaucracy that sets very strict limits or very strict standards on like what the job role is and when you get a promotion. So there is no nuance to it. Now, obviously, inequalities still exist, but that is exactly the kind of structure that machine learning techniques, which discern patterns and then predict individual solutions, it's kind of abductive learning, they're designed to avoid that, because the idea that you would have this kind of set path for everybody to follow is not why we're collecting billions of data points to make individual decisions. Those are two very different ways of thinking about the world. For my own part, I think, it becomes cliche, but I think like the garbage in, garbage out problem will remain incredibly important forever, because the sources of data that we're using to train these things are often not transferable between domains. And what you often find is that a standard for assessment was developed in one particular place or one particular platform, often tested internally on the people who are developing the system. And then it's deployed in a whole bunch of places that don't fit that. So garbage in, garbage out, remains a huge, huge issue. And the other thing that I would look to, which I think Tressie's Cash App thing made me think of too, is kind of more of an organizational point. And that is like, we tend to think of a lot of these systems in the workplace as belonging to the company where you're working, when usually they aren't. Usually there is a software as a service kind of thing, where it's a third-party platform licensed out to you. In many ways, this is like mainframe computing 70 years ago. The firm does not own that Salesforce subscription or whatever. Salesforce pushes updates. Salesforce is collecting data as much as the firm is. So there's a third party that is now brokering the relationships between employers and employees. That's a very difficult thing to organize around, a very different thing to regulate than just typical employer discrimination. And it leads to all these other problems, like the Cash App thing that I was talking about. Like that makes complete sense, that these administrative data is supposed to come directly from W-2 stuff. And then what happens if you develop this whole ecosystem because the W-2 economy failed and you've had to adapt it around this new third-party platform, but the administrative state still works on the old rules. It doesn't absorb this new broker and everything. So that can seem like a basic thing, that it is a third party and neither worker nor employer. But I think it really changes how we think about these things in terms of regulation, in terms of workplace politics.
Thanks. And Shamsi. You're muted, Shamsi.
Sorry, there was a notification that popped up that grabbed the focus. Yeah, I totally agree with what everyone else has said, and I'm going to end this part of the question with something very simple. I think that we as consumers, we need to be very much aware of what AI can actually do. And so we need to not necessarily think of AI as a superhuman or a perfect human who can basically do everything that a human can't. As Andrew pointed out, that AI is good at certain things, so it's not going to be inattentive, but it might make other kinds of mistakes. So knowing that AI has limitations as well, and being able to take that into account when we deploy AI for certain things, I think that that's going to be very powerful. Also, kind of like the transparency issue that Tressie brought up, I think that that's extremely important, knowing what AI can do. And even in design, kind of like making sure that these things are apparent, that, well, maybe add some kind of like, I would say, uncertainty around the AI decisions. So I can't necessarily say or come up with something that says that, well, AI has been really good at this right now. But I think that as humans who are consuming AI, I think we will do much better if we add some amount of uncertainty, and I shouldn't say mistrust, but at least we should question some of the decisions when they don't match our mental models.